Greetings, everyone. I am very excited today to be in conversation with my good friend, Juliet Sinisterra, who I've known for 5 years now and have a great deal of respect for. And we're going to be talking about her very integrative work, particularly with urban planning, and how I really view you, Juliet, as an Aquarian pioneer and innovator, really guiding us into some of these new paradigms that we're moving into with the age of Aquarius. But let me introduce you and then we'll dive into our conversation. So, Juliet has a degree in architecture and has spent the last 30 years in urban design, master planning, and sustainable community development across the state of Washington here in the US. She is passionate about integrating urban systems with the wisdom of nature and indigenous wisdom. And she works to develop regenerative urban landscapes and nature-based infrastructure that honor and support all forms of life. And one of the things that I think is amazing about you, Juliet, is how you also are a gifted astrologer. I've co-taught classes with you. I refer to you constantly for people to do readings. But you've also really connected with your Colombian roots and done shamanic training that you also weave into your life, into your work, and into your perspective on urban planning. So this is extraordinary how you're holding this integrative, holistic model that I think is really a good example for all of us about how we can move into some of these new paradigms in a pragmatic way. So welcome. Thank you for being in this conversation today.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. Thank you for your kind words. And oh my gosh, it's just been such a joy to work with you and get to know you these past 5 years. Your work has really, I think, enriched my work. So being in relationship with you has really been a wonderful journey and growth experience for me as well. Yeah, so I'm just happy to be here. I'm happy to chat away.
So tell us some about what you're doing, because you're really doing some very innovative work in your community around this kind of sustainable urban planning.
Yeah, so in my community, I run a public development authority, which is a community-based form of economic and urban development. And so I work with a pretty substantial board that represents the district that I work in. We work a lot with community partners and stakeholders. And I've been in this position for just over 3 years now. It's been a really great fit for me. And I've been bringing kind of my own vision to this work as well, that really does start to integrate kind of the nature-based infrastructure, regenerative urbanism. There is a movement really starting to happen, I think, at the global level, even around nature positive design and nature positive urban development. And so it's really starting to look at, how can the city or urban systems start to replicate nature? Nature brings us tremendous wisdom that's evolved over the last 3.8 billion years. And how can we as humans look to that and start to integrate that into how we plan and design cities? My particular district, it has a lot of universities within it. So about 2/3 of the land, it's about 770 acres total. 2/3 of the land is university-owned property. So they're kind of in charge of that. But the other portions, it's actually a severely distressed district. So there's quite a bit of poverty within the district. There's very little green space or open space. There's a tremendous urban heat island effect, very little street trees. And so we're really looking at how can we also start to make this district more livable, more, greater connections to nature. I mean, all that, it provides a psychological benefit to folks. But the nature positive principles applied to this is really interesting in that it's also looking at, how can we start to, one, take some of the, this is kind of getting a little bit more technical, but take some of the water that's being evaporated through our earth overheating and start to pull that back into the earth. And how can we start to do that in urban landscapes as well? That starts to make it, habitable, beautiful to be in, starts to have places that feel like you're in nature, but you're also in an urban environment. Our urban systems have been, with all of the pavement and hardscape and buildings, they've really put tremendous pressure on Earth systems. And so how can we rethink that in a different way? And I could keep going.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is, I read a paper that you wrote on this, and a couple things really struck me. One was that you indicated that 56% of our world's population live in urban environments. So it really highlights how critical it is to begin to address how to reconfigure how we are living in urban environments for all the reasons you were just describing. But you also mentioned, and I'd love for you to say a little bit more of what this means, that as humanity, we have crossed 6 of 9 biophysical boundaries that allow life on Earth. What does that mean?
Yeah, so it is a really interesting principle that I was actually just listening to a podcast last weekend about planetary boundaries, and the scientist that's been leading that work for the last 20 years was talking about it. And the interviewer was saying, how can the majority of people not know and understand this? It just hasn't, climate change is one of those 9 boundaries, but it's really looking at our planetary system as a whole, and that it has limits, it has boundaries within our planet. And so, the 6 of the 9 include like biodiversity loss, nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, climate change is another one, ocean acidification is one. So there's kind of these 9 systems that are really crucial for how our Earth functions in a healthy way. How kind of that flow of life, that reciprocity, that vitality of life kind of flows within those 9 systems. And the scientists have worked, I think the institute is out of Germany, but it's really more international work at this point. And I think they started in like 2005 or so, and they started issuing reports like 2010, 13. They just put one out last year in 2023. And they really found that those 9 systems were the most crucial. One is the water cycle as well. They are the most crucial to sustaining life on Earth. And so, our climate is a reflection of that. But really, for me, it's like, bringing in my spiritual ideas and thoughts and feelings. It's also like, how do we start to learn to live in relationship with Earth? I like to call her Pachamama, because I feel like she has her own energy and consciousness. And, I think that is such an important aspect of our human evolution, is learning to move beyond kind of that need to control nature. And then how do we learn to start to be in relationship with nature in an equal, like, reciprocity? And I think that it not only does it help the well-being of her, but it helps our well-being as well. And so my community isn't, I'm not sharing all of this regularly with my community, but I feel like these principles applied in a pragmatic way are also very important. So both through a spiritual and a pragmatic application, ideally it's going to help move us as a world and as a way we live on this planet to a different level. So
I so agree with you, Juliet, as you know, from how much it's a strong theme in my work that we need to come back into right relationship with the earth and with the sacredness of all of life, and that we've really been in this period of disconnection across the last 5,000 years. And we're on a path of destruction unless we come back into that awareness of the consciousness of the earth and that we are a part of this whole interconnected ecosystem and that everything around us is conscious. So that part of what I think is really important then is the steps that we take with urban planning or with how we're structuring cities, with how we live our lives, come then from that right relationship, that sense of love and honoring.
I mean, it's been interesting in this process because, I'm definitely not a biologist, but I have really been studying more about kind of nature systems and biological systems and learning how that can be applied to my district. So what we did last year was we did an ecological asset study of the district, and we looked at kind of 12 different ecosystem services that urbanism or life provides, clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, soil, diversity, kind of all these different aspects of health, and human health and well-being was also one of them. And so we looked at from almost a data scientific standpoint, like, okay, how do we measure that in the district, and what were these conditions pre-development and what are they now, and how can we start to, through our urban interventions, go back to a much healthier set of ecosystem services, even things like wildlife. How do we in our urban systems also provide space for wildlife? We live in a community that we have pretty close wildlife boundaries in certain areas. And oftentimes in the summer when it's hot, we'll find moose coming through our urban parks and they're trying to get to the water, and they're coming down from the mountains. And, I've talked with my design team, like, how can we start to think about wildlife corridors that allow for the moose to come, and access the river in a really easy way that's non-threatening to them. So I think there's just a lot of ways to rethink the city. I think there's a beauty to the city. There's a beauty to the creativity and the innovation and the connectivity you can get within a city. But then it's starting to rethink it. How do those systems start to change? And they're less about kind of this domination and control and all about centralized finance and things like that, and starts to become a place for people to really come together, in community and with nature and with their place, like celebrating the place that they are in and the beauty of that place. I think sometimes when we're in the city, we can easily forget the beauty of nature because we're not connected to it regularly. So, it's kind of all of those things combined that we're really trying to now inform. How do we incentivize urban development based on this? How do we prioritize investments based on this? What do those look like? How can we, one of the things that's come up is thinking about soil health. And the district I'm in, it's through erosion and development and asphalt. It's basically right on bedrock. And how can you start to restore the soils that can create community gardens and green space, but that can also retain the water? It's so important to have a healthy water cycle. It's just, that's central to all of life. And so how can our urban system start to integrate a really healthy water cycle back into those systems?
So how do you do that at the practical level? How do you begin to, when you've got an urban environment that's already established, how do you begin to make those changes to move it in that more healing direction?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. There are people doing this work all over the world and in really beautiful ways and in much different, not every application is unique. There's a number of kind of permaculturists, at the global level, particularly working in places like Uganda and Sudan and impoverished areas, particularly from the perspective of water. And how can you start to pull the water back into the landscape, into these villages where then they can grow their own food. They have much more self-sufficiency. They have clean water. And so a woman like Natalie Topa, for instance, she's someone I've really been studying her work lately with the villages. She calls them sponge villages in Africa. And so, the forest acts like a sponge. I mean, it's constantly pulling through gravity water back into its system. It's pulling it in through the leaves of the trees. It's pulling it down into its roots, into the mycelium, and then it builds up the soil. And I mean, it's just this absolutely beautiful cyclical process, and how the trees work in collaboration with the atmosphere to like maintain this whole water cycle. And so she's become really attuned to that and applying it into these sponge cities. Like, how can a village become this sponge that's also doing that as part of the water cycle? And China is actually doing quite a bit of this kind of more larger scale sponge city concept. But a lot of that's kind of some of its newer cities. Los Angeles is starting to apply the sponge city models because they have a massive water problem as well. So they're trying to kind of create these big kind of, I think, ponds where they can pull water back into the earth. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I'm working with a really fantastic urban design team out of Seattle, and a lot of this is new to them as well. And we are still trying to figure it out. And we started talking about Janine Benyus, who is the founder of biomimicry. She uses the term pixelated healing. And so in an urban environment, sometimes you can't just, plow through and do this massive intervention that just heals everything. But how can you start to do this kind of pixelated healing in pockets of places throughout, a neighborhood or a district? And then ideally they start to kind of come together and start to create their own cycles of healing, in collaboration. So, we are looking to do a kind of a larger kind of pilot proof of concept kind of intervention within the district. And it's actually, that's getting really interesting in and of itself, because we're starting to actually pull in some of the indigenous wisdom and working with the tribal wisdom into that pilot project. But that will be just one probably section of the district. So again, it's like urbanism also takes time. Nothing is fast with urbanism. However, with this Uranus and Taurus, maybe it'll be a little faster. I don't know. Yeah. So.
Well, I do think that Uranus and Taurus is calling us to see the truth of what's going on and how do we come back into right relationship with the earth. But it seems like a component of this, Juliet, is how do we as people and people living in the urban environment, in these communities, change our attitudes so that, I mean, part of the indigenous wisdom is that sense of being deeply connected to the land, that relationship is so key to who we are.
Yeah.
And so we then feel that sense of connection to the land, to the community there, in a way that is fostering this kind of right relationship. So is part of it educating people in how to come into a different relationship with the land?
Well, I mean, that is interesting you bring that up. There's a lot of kind of concurrent work going on in the community around those issues. So there is a group of folks, I'm a kind of a part of another group that's looking to develop or create an environmental learning and cultural center that is really integrated with our public school system. The tribe in my area, they have members on that committee as well. And, how can we create curriculum? How can we create learning and around indigenous ways, but then also, bringing in the science of nature as well. So it's kind of a both and situation. So that group is already starting to develop some curriculum through the public school system here. Our tribe, our indigenous tribe on these lands, they're really working with restoring the salmon in our river, which was kind of the primary life force for that tribe. And still is to a large degree. And they just got a massive grant in order to kind of continue those restoration efforts. But again, it's like none of this, the salmon restoration also needs to be thought of in relationship with the land restoration. And so all of nature works in this kind of cyclical flow. And so it's also kind of trying to bring all these pieces together. So the other group that is coming out of a foundation, a local health foundation that we have, a community health group. They've been working with a lot of local tribes through our American Indian Community Center to create an integrated cultural healing model. And so it's really looking at cultural healing from this integrated perspective that is very much informed by indigenous wisdom. And it's that group that we're starting to have some conversations on how could we implement some of those principles that they're developing into the urban landscape. So how can there start to again be this relationship where that work informs how we create urban form? And so
that's so beautiful. It's so layered, isn't it?
There's a
In
lot of
terms of
layers. Yeah, there's a lot of layers. And, and granted, some people in the community are very educated on this, but then there's a lot that aren't. I think my board I do have some board members that are really savvy to this and, excited, and others that are still coming along, but they're open-minded and they're, I think most everyone in Spokane is very aware of the prominence of the tribe to this region. The tribe does a great job of doing outreach and telling their story and the history of the tribe. I brought in their cultural historian to present to my board, actually the first year I was in this position, to kind of go through the entire history of that tribe. And so it's kind of, the awareness levels are definitely increasing. And so that's lovely to see, for sure.
Speaking of that, Juliet, you and I have been in conversation, prior to getting on this recording, about the level of poverty in the area there, and your strong intuitive sense that some of that is related to the trauma that happened to the tribe and to their strong connection with horses. And I know, I've been in contact with Sandy Humby, who I interviewed, who does a lot of work with healing the trauma in land so that there can be a different energetic there, and the energy of those traumas linger on and affect the people that are living on the land generations later. Yeah. So talk some about that trauma that happened and how, because I think that's such a beautiful part of what you're doing in your work, is weaving in that way of also healing and clearing that trauma in a way that can provide a different energetic for the land there.
Yeah. Just to back up a little bit on that, I remember probably about the same time that you and I first connected, I was actually living in Oregon at that point in time and was starting to kind of work with a group on reconceptualizing some land that had been like a Japanese internment camp during World War II. And so there was a lot of conversations then about the trauma that inflicted on those communities. But then, as urban designers, like, how do we think about that as the land too? The land is actually absorbing a lot of this trauma that was held from those communities. And so that kind of started piquing my interest back then, and coming back to my hometown and starting to become much more aware of the story of the tribe and kind of the actual incredible trauma that was inflicted upon this tribe. Also started kind of thinking that same way. So the tribe, the indigenous tribe of these lands, they're actually, they were a very powerful tribe. They were not a large tribe, but again, I mentioned we had a really strong salmon, salmon that came through our river. And we have just an absolutely gorgeous river through the center of our city with gorgeous falls. And I mean, at one point, the tribe says during peak salmon season, you could walk across the river on the backs of the salmon. It was so, abundant with salmon. And because they had such an abundant food source, they were also very giving. And so they would invite a lot of the other tribes from Eastern Washington and Idaho and Montana to come and partake in the harvesting of the salmon as well. And so it was very much kind of this communal, celebratory, regional gathering place. And so they were a very respected tribe, very powerful tribe. And when the United States government started coming west and settling more and more of the Western lands, of course, they started getting into conflict. And I think it was in 1858, there was a series of wars with the local tribe. The first war, the local tribe soundly defeated the U.S. troops just kind of south of where I am now. And after that, they brought in a colonel who, in retrospect, understanding all that he did to culturally decimate this tribe, I think was probably not the most healthiest stably mental individual. But he kind of brought in the cannons, he was a big gun, he brought in the big guns, and they really started kind of decimating the tribe, not just through military aspects, but culturally trying to decimate them. And at one point they went up the river and were just, burning villages as they went up the river. And I think they were collecting horses as they went. And when they got really close to the it's still along the river, but it's near the Washington-Idaho border, the U.S. government men were ordered to slaughter, I think, up to 900 horses. And they did this in front of the tribe. So they slaughtered their horses there. I mean, it was just this complete effort to culturally decimate these people. And so, in retrospect, that's not even that long ago. It's less than 200 years ago. Anyhow, so I just, hearing that story, I've been hearing that story more and more lately, and just, when it hits you, it's really difficult to hear. And, there are some paintings of it. There's a small little plaque, which actually kind of honors the U.S. government, basically winning over the territory at that point in time on the site of the slaughter. But I have been thinking, like, that has to have created obviously it's created tremendous trauma within the local tribe, but also within the land. And how can we, start to recognize that and work in partnership with the tribe to heal that and honor that, that wound, because we all are a part. Obviously we were the perpetrators and I say that as, my white ancestral history, and thinking about how urbanism can start to honor that too and create healing spaces. And I've been, wanting to start working with the local tribe on how could even art and storytelling integrated into some of this nature-based infrastructure start to honor those horses, like the beauty of those horses and the strength and the power of those horses, and in the same time honoring the tribe, but different ways we can heal the land in a very public way. Like, I feel that the community needs to see how that is being healed. And we do have a tremendous poverty rate here. For a mid-sized city, we have some of the highest poverty in the country, really, and we have a number of severely distressed census tracts. And a lot of our, neighboring mid-sized cities don't have nearly the same poverty that we do. And so, that's another thing I've been playing with. It's like, what's created this? Why, in the context of how we've evolved as a community, why do we have such a substantial poverty rate? So anyway, so just intuitively, there seems to potentially be a connection there.
Well, I think you're just really tuning in energetically to the way in which that trauma gets passed down across the generations, but also held in the land. And it's just, I really respect how you're interfacing with the tribe and trying to create more healing around that trauma that has been very profound ancestral trauma for them, but then also how to clear that from the land, which absorbs and holds that kind of trauma. So it's really powerful how you're working in that way as well.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to connecting with Sandy Humby on this, to kind of just talk through this in different ways. I might be able to work with her, or bring her work, into how we might look at healing the land through this. So
Because she's been very tuned into how that trauma that the land holds affects the people generations later that are living there and
yeah.
still absorbing those energies. So that's great. Talk some about your Colombian roots and your shamanic training.
Yeah, so my father is Colombian. He actually came here as an exchange student for college, met my mother. And my great grandmother is Quechuan. So she, that's the indigenous, one of the indigenous tribes along the Andes. And that's been really kind of wonderful for me to understand those ancestral roots. He also is descended from conquistadors that came from Spain. So I also feel like, in a way, we all kind of hold the dark and the light within us. And so, kind of reconciling that too, within my own self and, you know, in a way, not negating that part of me as well, but knowing it's there, and the complexities of us as human beings too, just kind of how those ancestral energies start to come through us through the ages. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I actually, when I was living in Oregon, I got connected with a group of shamanic practitioners there that were studying the Caro and the Quechuan lineage, and just by chance, it's just how things happen. And did a series of medicine wheels with them. Um, I am a mesa carrier. I like to do despachos. When I have the time, I try and do them on eclipse energies, where again, it's so much about the notion of reciprocity and being in relationship with the land, being in relationship with the mountains around you, the rivers, I love how the Caro Quechuan lineage calls in sacred space, that it's almost sort of like a very right-brained way of just calling in the elements, the plants, the animals, the landscape around you, and that you're always in, they like to say, you're not invoking it, you're convoking it, because we're always in relationship with these things, we just have forgotten. And so how can we remember, and just always every day, I try and go out and do blessings on my land. I have a small urban lot, but I still try and bless it. I've created a rose garden in honor of Venus. It's just kind of this notion of how do we start to integrate mindfulness about our relationship with nature and with Pachamama, just in everyday practices. And to me, like the despacho is sort of a ceremonial way to do that, where I create kind of an earth art kind of painting that, I'll add in the flowers and the leaves, and I'll even sprinkle in like cookies or, sparkles, and and then you burn it. You build this kind of beautiful earth art, and then you actually burn it. So it's, I love the how the Quechua and Caro bring in playfulness and kind of silliness, and that, I think there is a lot of seriousness in our world, but we also still need to learn the beauty of life and nature. And Pachamama, she's always sharing her fullness, her full beauty, her joy, her playfulness. And I think we can, as we become more in relationship with her from a conscious perspective, she wants us to live like that with her, and so I love that the shamanic traditions really honor that relationship is kind of the priority. So
Oh, that's so beautifully said, Juliet. And I love that sense of not invoking, but honoring the connection, the communication, the communion that's already there. We just need to open to it again. And to me, in my own training with the Caro and some of the Peruvian shamanic traditions, I love that despacho ceremony, which is, making this prayer bundle. Like you said, it's art, and it's all about gratitude.
Mhm.
And it's really taught me in my own daily practice, like you said, how to be, I honor the trees on my property by name. I honor the plants, the animals, the hummingbirds that come. It brings us back into that relationship, into that gratitude, which opens our hearts. So
Yeah.
I think some of what's beautiful in your work is it's not it's informed by all of your training and your gifts, but ultimately it's about really integrating the heart and how we do come back into right relationship. And talk a little bit about that Caro concept of Aini that
Yeah.
is the
So
core of their spiritual tradition.
yeah, Aini is reciprocity. And so it is this, to me, I think of it as the flow of life. It's that give and take, of giving and receiving, and really from an equitable standpoint. And to me, it is so representative of the age of Aquarius, like that as our unique selves, we share the beauty of who we are with other. And in turn, they share with us. And in that flow of sharing, of communion, we become richer, we become more whole, we become healed. And so, when I first started working with the shamans, and the notion of going out and blessing the landscape, it was so foreign to me. It was just like, this is so odd, no, that's how odd our brains have become, so boxed in. And now it just seems like, well, of course you do that, of course that's how we live. That's how, all of this beauty is around us, and we need to be in gratitude with it, in sharing. And I think it's not just, it's honoring and being grateful for Pachamama and for nature and for all that is, but it's also sharing the beauty of us with that, so it's like it goes both ways. So
Yeah. And it's like you said, it's that mutuality, that reciprocity, that being in right relationship and coming back to that connection out of love.
yeah, yep,
It's beautiful.
yeah, the power of the heart. So for sure.
And it's just, I think, so powerful how you're weaving all these ways of understanding into this healing work that you're doing in the urban environment. And I know you've done some training with the whole transition towns
Yeah.
movement. Talk some about what that means and how that is part of this process of realizing we're moving into this new paradigm, new age, and how we are in that transition.
Yeah, yeah, I did that in like 2007, I think 2008. It was a while ago. And actually that movement kind of came out of England, but it was really based in the notion that, we do live on a finite planet, and these natural resources, we're just kind of taking them for granted. And, how do we start to learn to live in community in a much more mindful way? How do we go through a transition? We've, as as astrologers are talking right now, we're in this first quarter square of the Saturn and Jupiter. And, that is that moment of crisis. And nature also has that moment of crisis. It's in their cycle of disruption. And in a way, that's how in the cyclical processes, nature will, start as a seed and then start to grow. And it's almost like the moon cycle, really. But at some point, there is this kind of chaos or disruption, and where things collapse. But at that same time, that's when the greatest creativity and innovation and insights come into being. And so it's lovely to understand that that's nature's cycle, and we're also a part of nature, and we're going through that now. And so I think the transition towns were recognizing, okay, things are going to change. They're going to look different, but how do we come together in community and support one another and start to create these new systems that in a way are much more simple, that are much more in connection with nature, that aren't necessarily looking to consume or acquire or grow or expand, through economic means, but more through relationship and simplicity. So yeah, it was a beautiful training, and it was quite psychological. Like, they must have had people like you and on that training, because it was, also that notion of, okay, psychologically, how do you handle this? How do you handle, extreme change? So
Part of what you're saying that is so key, I think, in how we are understanding this time is to understand that this is a time of chaos, that is where we're deconstructing these old paradigms. But as Elizabeth Sahtouris talks about, the evolution biologist, she said it's in those times, as you said, of crisis, that nature has its capacity for an evolutionary leap.
yeah,
And that
yeah,
this is our opportunity as humanity
yeah,
to make this evolutionary leap from this more, what she would describe as immature way of being as a species, where we're caught in competition, conquest, domination, back into that understanding that everything thrives by being interdependent and
yeah,
honoring that interconnectedness. So the chaos that we're in, as you said, is opening the possibility of creativity and this evolutionary leap. And
yeah.
that we need to not try to cling to the patterns of the past, but to really see this as an opportunity for profound transformation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that notion of maturity is really important. I feel like, we, in a way, as a culture and society, and this is almost global, like we've had so much abundance, energy and water systems and air and all these things that we in a way, we just take it for granted, and we're almost like teenagers. Everything's provided. We're just cruising along, enjoying, our lives. But it's like nature and consciousness is like almost wanting to say, like, hey, wake up. Like, you have this gorgeous planet, you have this beautiful place to be, and you need to learn how its systems, you need to learn what its planetary boundaries are, you need to learn how to honor it within relationship and not just abuse it by overconsumption and mindlessness. And so how do we as a culture start to mature into into our own self spiritually and consciously, but also into kind of the beauty of matter, the beauty of nature, and how do we bring those two together? So
And as you were saying before, it's so multi-layered. I mean, I was really struck when you were talking about your own ancestral history, and that you've got these indigenous roots, but then you also have the conquistadors. And in my recent interview with Jason Engeldo, he was talking about, he lives in South Africa, how he's got connections back to the bush people, but also the Europeans who came and colonized Africa. That part of what you're saying that I think is so wise, Juliet, is we have to come into that awareness that we have those different aspects within us.
yeah,
How do we heal that, come back into wholeness within ourselves, which then opens us more fully to living consciously and being in right relationship with each other and the sacredness of all of the life around us. So it's an inner healing and transformation as well as an outer transformation.
yeah. I mean, the shamans like to say that it's important to know your lineage up to the point where the dirt is up around your neck. Like, you're embedded into this soil, into this planet. And I think the importance of that is just what you said. It's like, we are these complex beings, and the more that we can hold and understand that complexity, that we have like the best of humanity and the worst of humanity within us, like it and when we can start to come from a more whole healed place, then we bring less judgment, we bring less blame, we bring less othering people. And like, instead, how can we create belonging to hold this bigger container for all of that? Because I feel like that container is what we need to really create this new earth that we're trying to move towards. So,
which is such a beautiful expression of that Aquarian understanding that we're all interconnected and that we're moving into these new paradigms of community and collaboration and co-creation.
yeah, yeah. Because the more people, I think, when we can hold our whole self, even the parts of ourselves we don't like, we are in that healed state. I mean, it's like what Dr. Gilbert says, that I love in one of, I think, the biogeometry classes, he was talking about the Vesica Pisces, and that the good isn't in just the dark or just the light, and the bad isn't in just the dark. The good is where they overlap. And that's really the true meaning of the Vesica Pisces. And so that healed place of being in that overlap, that is how we can move forward, that we can reconcile the polarities, we can come together and through creativity, and people can release their shame. Because I feel like it's that shame of not being good enough or the need for perfection that really prevents people from owning their power from a place of grace and humility that then allows them to be in that co-creation. So if you're coming from shame, it's really difficult to co-create. But if we can start to learn to hold all of who we are, then I think we can really get to that place.
Beautifully said. So it really is about holding ourselves with compassion and honoring our wholeness. And then, I think as you and I both also share, then it's also honoring those energies of the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine within us to give birth to that unity consciousness and that way of living in integration and balance. And that's, I know, so woven into your work as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I have found, well, the archetypal work with you has been incredibly healing for me. That you've taught through your classes and woven that through your teachings, but also just that notion of the dark feminine. Me growing up a good little Catholic schoolgirl, it was very hard. That notion of the dark feminine, has been really a difficult notion for me. But when I started doing the shamanic work, actually, they were really wanting me to work with that and how to hold that in a different way, and understand that role of the dark feminine, that it really is about that transmutation of that death, life, rebirth, that going through understanding our shadow, holding it in a different way, being willing to be transformed by it. It really allows us to come into our full selves in a much more profound way.
Mm. And talk some about the course that you're doing where you're really weaving a lot of this together.
Yeah, so I have decided to launch my first course. This is something it's been in the back of my head forever. And it really, I love the spiritual work that I do because it really helps me get into my right brain. And, so much of my work is left brain planning and coordinating and all this. And the spiritual work and the astrology work, it really, for me, becomes a right brain exercise. And so the course, I'm really excited about it. And I'm actually trying to kind of bring together the left and the right brain in this course. So I'm trying to pull in kind of my work in the world with regenerative urbanism and nature-based infrastructure, and how do we actually start to think and understand Earth systems so that we can work in relationship with them, be in reciprocity with them. So there's a whole component of kind of what I'm calling the mundane teachings around Earth and nature. And then I'm also wanting to bring in the mythic, which is really about the dark feminine and how we can hold that whole of who we are and understand the role of the dark feminine, the role of crisis, the role of chaos in our lives, and how it can help us become these co-creators for the new earth that we're wanting to build. So I'm kind of hoping that bridging those two concepts, with a teaching, an earth teaching and a mythic teaching, over a series of 7 months, and weaving in astrological chart interpretations as well. Participants can start to get to the place where we can start to be those co-creators together. So
it's a wonderful course, and it's starting in September. Is that accurate?
actually in November. So
November. Okay.
yeah, I a number of years ago I did a Celtic wheel course that really aligned with the feminine. Started with Samhain and kind of the dark feminine. And I started, in researching Samhain, it initially was celebrated when the Pleiades were in the midnight sky opposite the sun. And so like around the 20th, 21st of November. And I just thought that was really beautiful, that notion of kind of launching it. We're looking at Earth's systems, but then bringing in the Pleiades. So it's again, that both and so it's also launching that kind of dark feminine cycle and then moving towards the summer solstice. But so it'll run through, the Pleiades, opposite the sun in November, and then to when they're conjunct with the sun in May. So that's when the course will run.
So beautiful how you're weaving in the wisdom of the earth and the sky and the Pleiades, because I think they are playing such a critical role in this time of transformation also. I mean, they're symbolic that way in the cycle of the year, but they're also, I think, playing a critical role in the precessional cycle and this profound time of shift that we're in right now. And I think it's very significant astrologically that Uranus in Taurus is very close to the Pleiades in the sky right now, calling that energy into our consciousness to help us with this transformation. So I'll put the link to your course below, but it's very exciting how you're bringing this together.
Don't you think it's fascinating how Algol is right before the Pleiades, like in the wheel? I mean, I feel like in a way that's sort of also that, that chaos that comes in potentially with Algol. And I know there's a lot of complexity around the Algol energies, but then it also kind of paves the way for the Pleiades that come in as well, and how that can open up new energy. So.
Oh, we could talk a whole hour about this. Because and I actually just put out a video about Algol, but I think what you're saying that's so important is also that part of the sky where Algol is that part of the sky that Bernadette Brady calls in the stare of Cetus, with Cetus the whale and Perseus the warrior. So I think that part of the sky is also how do we integrate those energies of the sacred masculine and sacred feminine rather than having them be at odds with each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is that way in which those energies have been polarized that is a part of what's led to this disconnection we've been in for the last 5,000 years, which has led to the destruction of the earth and the disconnection from the sacredness of life. And you're right. I think Uranus has gone through that part of the sky and now is by the Pleiades saying it's time to bring this together in a healing way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, really lovely. So,
well,
thank
you so much for the work that you're doing, Juliet, and your own integration process, and for the way in which you're guiding us and supporting us in how to move into these new paradigms. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. It's just, to me, it is learning to live from that place of joy within my heart. And this is how the energy moves through me. And it's lovely, now that I'm in my midlife, to be able to feel more confident and safe in sharing who I am with everyone, with others. So thank you.
Beautiful. And thank you to this community for how we're working together to co-create this new world that is more in balance and reciprocity and honoring of the earth. Blessings and love to all of you.